Frank Henderson was just an old Uber driver on the streets of Los Angeles. At least, that's what his passengers thought. But little did anyone know that his hands had restarted thousands of hearts over the past 40 years. That night, everything would change. At 75, with graying hair and a deeply lined face, Frank Henderson was one of Los Angeles' oldest Uber drivers. His 2015 Honda Civic was clean but old. The car smelled faintly of medication, and Frank seemed to cough constantly. He always kept a small water bottle, a packet of tissues, and an aspirin in the back seat, old doctor habits. His passengers were often disappointed when they saw him. Expecting a young, energetic driver, they found an older, slow-moving one. Frank's hands were slightly shaky, not from age, but from nerve damage from his 40-year career as a surgeon. But no one knew that detail. Driving Uber in Los Angeles wasn't easy, especially at Frank's age. He averaged 12 to 15 rides a day, working from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. His younger passengers treated him with impatience, sometimes asking him to switch vehicles. "Can this guy drive safely?" they'd whisper. On the way from Beverly Hills to Malibu, wealthy customers were often irritated by Frank's old car and modest appearance. Once, 3 young men in their 20s got into Frank's car. One said to his friend, "The man's hands are shaking. What if he crashes?" The other replied, "What are old people doing in a car?" Frank heard these words, but remained silent. If only they knew, those trembling hands had repaired thousands of hearts. But Frank's true story was quite different. He wasn't just an old driver. Dr. Franklin Henderson was a world-renowned medical legend who worked as a cardiac surgeon at Stanford University School of Medicine for 40 years. His hands had performed more than 8,500 heart surgeries. He had repaired the hearts of presidents, Hollywood stars, and billionaires. In Frank's office, a room now empty, hundreds of thank-you letters hung on the walls. Photographs from patients he'd saved, reports of successful surgeries, articles in medical journals. Each one was a part of his extraordinary career. But now, no one entered this room. Frank's home library contained 47 scientific articles and 3 books he had written on medicine. His book, Modern Cardiac Surgery Techniques, was used as a textbook in medical schools worldwide. But Frank no longer even mentioned them. His surgical career began in 1978. Back then, he was a young, ambitious doctor with boundless energy. In his early years, he would take on the most challenging cases, spending nights in the operating room. His colleagues called him the Miracle Doctor because he could successfully complete seemingly impossible cases. In 1985, Frank performed a surgery that would make history. An 8-year-old child, Emily Chen, was born with a congenital heart anomaly, and other doctors had told him there was nothing left to do. The child's family came to Stanford as a last hope. In a 14-hour surgery, Frank reconstructed Emily's heart. This surgery became known in medical literature as the Henderson Technique. Emily was now 37, married, and had 2 children. Every year, she sent Frank a birthday card. "I owe you my life, Dr. Henderson," she always wrote. Frank kept these cards, but now he couldn't get Emily's last card because he hadn't informed her of his change of address. One of Frank's proudest moments was performing emergency heart surgery on President Clinton in 1994. That night, he received an emergency call from the White House, and he was flown to Washington on Air Force One. The 6-hour surgery was completed successfully, and the president made a full recovery. But Frank wouldn't tell anyone this story. Patient confidentiality was sacred to him. Throughout his career, Frank was a doctor for everyone, not just the wealthy. He performed free surgeries for uninsured patients, participated in medical missions in Africa, and helped the wounded in war zones. In his view, The heart knew no bounds. The hearts of the poor and the rich beat equally. In 1999, while on a medical mission in Rwanda, he operated on more than 200 children affected by war. In one photo taken at the time, Frank, his white coat covered in blood, looked at the camera with a tired but happy expression. Around him, children were smiling as they recovered. This photo appeared on the cover of Time magazine titled, "Heroes of Modern Medicine." In 2005, he volunteered in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Hospitals were flooded, requiring urgent medical attention. Frank spent 3 weeks there, saving the lives of 47 people in makeshift operating rooms. The working conditions were harsh. There was no electricity, and sterilization facilities were limited. But Frank didn't give up. In the final years of his career, Frank focused on training young doctors. The Henderson cardiac surgery program he founded at Stanford had trained 340 surgeons worldwide. These surgeons now work worldwide, using Frank's techniques to save lives. He decided to retire in 2018. The reason was simple. He was 72, and his hands were no longer as steady as they once were. Early signs of Parkinson's disease had begun, a slight tremor affecting Frank's fine motor skills. For a surgeon, this meant the end of a career. His retirement ceremony was celebrated with a grand event at Stanford. More than 500 people attended, former patients, colleagues, students, everyone was saying goodbye to Dr. Franklin Henderson. But for Frank, it was the beginning of a great emptiness. In the first months, he tried to stay home. He would read, garden, and watch television in his large Palo Alto home. But this lifestyle was too much for him. He had saved lives every day for 40 years. What would he do now? His wife, Helen, died of breast cancer in 2016. Helen was also a pediatrician. They had a perfect understanding of each other during their 45-year marriage. After Helen's death, Frank's vitality had diminished significantly. His children, David and Sarah, were busy with their own lives. David was a lawyer in New York, Sarah a university professor in Boston. Frank's days were now very monotonous. In the morning, he'd sip his coffee in front of Helen's photo and read the news. In the afternoon, he'd go to his old office at Stanford and check his mailbox. In the evening, he'd fall asleep in front of the TV. This was the life of one of the world's most renowned heart surgeons. He was beginning to become depressed. His psychologist, Dr. Martinez, had prescribed antidepressants, but Frank didn't want to take them. "I just need to keep busy," he kept saying. But he didn't know what to do. One day, he read an article in the Los Angeles Times about driving Uber. The article, titled, "A Second Career for Retirees, Uber Driving," told the story of Robert, a retired teacher. Robert had started working for Uber because he was bored in retirement, and he was very happy. "I'll meet people, travel the city, and earn some money," Frank thought. The idea intrigued him. He'd always worked in the sterile environment of hospitals, never having much interaction with normal people in everyday life. Perhaps this would be a new experience. When he told his family about this idea, everyone was shocked. His son, David, had shouted on the phone, "Dad, you're Dr. Franklin Henderson. You're on the cover of Time magazine and the president's doctor. What does driving an Uber mean?" His daughter, Sarah, had the same reaction. "Dad, you're one of the world's most famous heart surgeons. People admire you. What kind of nonsense is this?" But Frank was adamant. "Kids, I'm retired now. People don't know me anyway. They just see me as an old man named Frank. That liberates me. Maybe I want to be a normal person." When he started Uber in 2019, Frank set his own rules. He would use his real name, but not reveal his profession. When passengers asked, he would say, "Retired." That way, he could live like a normal person. His Uber profile picture showed a smiling, ordinary old man, no trace of Dr. Henderson, the legendary figure in the medical world. The first days were incredibly difficult. Technology was foreign to him, and he had to learn to use a GPS. For 40 years, his assistants had prepared everything for him, but now he was learning everything on his own. Using the Uber app, understanding the ride request system, understanding the payment process, it all seemed overwhelming. He only made 3 trips in the first week. Once, he went to the wrong address, and once, a passenger canceled because he couldn't use the GPS correctly. Frank's self-confidence was shaken. Using GPS was the best thing for a man who performed some of the world's most difficult surgeries. But over time, he learned the ropes. Young passengers were impatient, sometimes making rude remarks. He constantly heard comments like, "Dude, hurry up! Why is this guy so slow? Old drivers should be banned." But Frank was patient. Having encountered thousands of stressful situations in his surgical career, the challenges of Uber came easily to him. One of his most challenging moments occurred with a young couple. They were driving from LAX airport to Beverly Hills, and Frank was held up in traffic. The male passenger, annoyed, said, "What's this old man doing in a car? He should retire and stay home." His girlfriend agreed. "Seriously? These guys are dangerous. They're going to have accidents." Frank cried at home that night. Looking at Helen's photo, he said, "Maybe they're right, Helen. Maybe I really am old." But the next day, he was back on the road. Because driving Uber had given him something, a sense of purpose. Serving people, touching their lives, even in a small way. It was a sense of fulfillment similar to the satisfaction found in surgery. Over time, Frank became one of Los Angeles's most beloved drivers. He would chat with his passengers and listen to their concerns. Passengers, especially those going to hospitals, would confide in him. Frank would offer them moral support, but never tell them he was a doctor. He would simply say, "Everything will be okay," and offer as much comfort as he could. One time, a young mother was on her way to Cedars-Sinai Hospital with her daughter. The child was scheduled for heart surgery, and she was terrified. Frank saw the worried faces of mother and daughter in the rearview mirror, and his heart sank. "Don't worry, ma'am," Frank said. "There are very good doctors at Cedars-Sinai. Heart surgery is very safe now." The mother was surprised. "Are you knowledgeable about these things?" Frank's heart sank. He had performed hundreds of surgeries at that hospital. He could have performed the child's surgery himself. But all he said was, "I'm a bit educated." The next week, when he saw the same mother and daughter again, the child was fine, and the mother was overjoyed. "Uncle Frank, the surgery was a success," the little girl had said. Frank had returned home very happy that day. Moments like these gave Frank back his joy of life. He might no longer be performing heart surgery, but he could still reach people. That March evening, Frank was preparing for his last trip. The call he received at 7:30 p.m. was for a ride from downtown LA to UCLA Medical Center. The passenger was Bradley Martinez, a young 34-year-old lawyer. But this time, it would change Frank's life forever. Bradley was angry in the car. He was constantly talking on the phone and treating Frank rudely. "Go fast! I'm running late!" he shouted. Frank was driving calmly through traffic, but Bradley continued to grow impatient. "Old man, can you do this job? Maybe it's time to retire," Bradley said, showing no respect for Frank. Frank had grown accustomed to these words. "I'm going as fast as I can, sir," he replied calmly. As they drove down the freeway, Bradley suddenly began having trouble breathing. At first, Frank thought he was acting out of stress. But the panic in Bradley's voice was genuine. "I can't breathe," Bradley whispered. Then, clutching his chest, he said, "My heart hurt so much." When Frank glanced at Bradley in the rearview mirror, he realized the gravity of the situation. The young man's face was pale, and he was sweating. These were classic signs of a heart attack. Frank quickly pulled over and turned around. Bradley was now slumped in the back seat, not breathing. He checked his pulse. It was very weak and irregular. This was a real heart attack and could be fatal within minutes. "I'm calling an ambulance," Frank said, but Bradley's condition was critical. They didn't have time to wait for an ambulance to arrive. At that moment, Frank's 40 years of medical experience kicked in. He couldn't perform a full-blown operation in the vehicle, but he could do some things. He placed Bradley in a comfortable position, loosened his shirt, and began to help him breathe. "Listen to me," Frank said, his voice now completely different, authority-filled, calm yet firm. "You're having a heart attack. Don't panic, I'm here." Bradley was surprised. Where did the confidence in this older driver's voice come from? Frank began applying steady compressions to Bradley's chest. He knew CPR perfectly. He also called 911 on the phone and reported the situation. 911, what's the emergency? This is Dr. Franklin Henderson. We have a heart attack in downtown LA. I'll send coordinates. We need a cardiology team. The 911 operator was surprised. Dr. Henderson? Are you Dr. Henderson from Stanford? Yes. I'm stabilizing the patient, but he needs immediate medical attention. Frank gave Bradley aspirin, he always carried it, and continued CPR. The young man's pulse was beginning to return. Bradley was beginning to realize who Frank was. Are you a doctor? I'm a cardiac surgeon, Frank said. Or rather, I'm a retired heart surgeon. In those 15 minutes, Frank had saved Bradley's life. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics recognized Frank. Dr. Henderson, what a surprise to see you here, said Chief Paramedic Johnson. This gentleman is lucky. As Bradley was being taken to the hospital, he turned to Frank. Are you really a famous doctor? Frank smiled. I'm just Frank now, an old Uber driver. The next day, the news made headlines in the Los Angeles Times. Famous heart surgeon saves lives by becoming an Uber driver. The story went viral, making headlines across America. Frank's phone was ringing nonstop. Former colleagues, journalists, television stations, everyone wanted to know why Dr. Franklin Henderson had become an Uber driver. A press conference was held at UCLA Medical Center. Bradley was now well and wanted to thank Frank. This man didn't just save my life, Bradley said through tears. He taught me a lesson in humility. I called him old man, when in fact he was one of the most gifted doctors in the world. Journalists were asking Frank questions. Dr. Henderson, why are you driving for Uber? Frank replied thoughtfully. I felt redundant in retirement. Driving for Uber gave me the opportunity to connect with people. Every passenger is a different story, a different life. I just play a small role in their journey. Do you have any regrets? Never. This experience taught me a lot. People judge by appearances. They just saw me as an old driver, but that liberated me. There were no expectations. I could just act like an ordinary person. Bradley also spoke. Dr. Henderson taught me an important lesson. We don't know who the other person is. We should treat everyone with respect because everyone has a story. The rest of the story was even more interesting. After Frank's story went viral on social media, the hashtag #RespectEveryDriver trended. People started treating Uber and taxi drivers with more respect. Uber made Frank a special offer, becoming the face of the company, the title of Uber Ambassador. Frank politely declined the offer, but said, train your drivers better, teach your customers respect. Frank's story touched many. Stanford University awarded him a Lifetime Achievement Award. But Frank arrived at the ceremony in an Uber vehicle and declared, "I'm still a driver." The most impressive development was Bradley's life change. The young lawyer was so impressed by Frank that he began philanthropic activities. "Frank showed me what true success is," he said. Frank now drives Uber part-time. He works just 3 days a week, and he prefers to transport passengers to hospitals because he knows he can help them the most. His Uber profile now says, "Medical emergencies welcome," and priority is given to emergency situations. Stanford University made Frank a special offer. As an emeritus consulting physician, he would mentor young surgeons. Frank accepted, spending 2 days a week at Stanford and 3 days with Uber. He still has his old stethoscope in the glove compartment of his car, just for emergencies. But many passengers now know Frank's identity. They address him as Dr. Frank and want to hear his story. Some passengers ask for advice on their family's medical problems. Frank helps them, but always says, "Be sure to see your doctor." Elderly patients, in particular, love Frank. They feel understood, too. "Finally, someone who understands us," they say. Frank doesn't just drive them. He's also a friend. The most significant change has been in people's perceptions of Uber drivers. Frank's story reminded them that everyone has a past, a story. Perhaps the person we're talking to is a doctor, a teacher, an artist, or a hero who saved lives. According to a Los Angeles Times investigation, complaints of discourteous behavior against Uber drivers decreased after Frank's story. People now speak to drivers with more respect, thank them, and tip them. Frank's greatest joy was that other retired doctors joined Uber drivers. Dr. Susan Miller, retired gynecologist, Dr. James Park, retired orthopedist, and Dr. Ahmed Hassan, retired neurologist, were all inspired by Frank to become Uber drivers. Thus, an informal network called the Dr. Driver Network was formed in Los Angeles. These medical drivers supported each other in emergencies and gave special attention to passengers traveling to hospitals. Uber recognized this and launched a special program, the Medical Driver Program. Drivers in this program received special training and were prioritized for medical emergencies. Today, Frank still walks the streets of Los Angeles. At 77, he drives a Honda Civic and drives for Uber. But he's no longer just a driver. He's a living icon who reminds us of the importance of respect and appreciation. Frank has a small sticker on the rear window. "Every person has a story." This sticker summarizes his philosophy on life. This story isn't Frank Henderson's story, actually. It's the story of all of us. Because each of us is so much more than meets the eye. And perhaps to better understand others, we simply need to listen and show respect. Frank still has his old surgical skills in his hands. But now they heal not only hearts, but also prejudices. And this is perhaps his greatest achievement. Every night on his way home, Frank looks at Helen's photo and says, "I touched someone's life today, Helen." Because even at 75, Frank Henderson is still a doctor. He just didn't have an ambulance anymore. Instead, he had a Honda Civic.